Good afternoon and welcome to the California Water Colloquium, our first lecture of fall term 2008. There we go. I'm Matt Condoff. I'm a member of the committee that organizes these things, and I'll be introducing our speaker. But first, a word from our sponsor, Linda Vida of the Water Resources Center Archives.
Thank you, Matt. I just wanted to say welcome to the first lecture of the fall. Welcome to the first lecture of the fall semester. And my name is Linda Vida. I'm the director of the Water Resources Center Archives. And we are the main logistical sponsor of the event. And I did want to thank the faculty committee that selects the speakers that I work with. Matt Condoff, Michael Hanneman, David Sedlak, Joe Sachs, and Professor Narasimhan. And I also want to thank our financial sponsors. We get support from deans across campus and some other centers as well. The College of Engineering, Natural Resources, the California Center for Environmental Law and Policy, which is part of the law school, Goldman School of Public Policy, the Beatrix Farron Fund of the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning, the Executive Vice Chancellor of the campus, the Berkeley Water Center, the Earth Sciences Division of Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and the Groundwater Resources Association. And I especially want to thank Carolyn Remick, who's the Executive Director of the Berkeley Water Center, for sponsoring the reception. We intend to have a reception before each lecture for the fall semester, and also Claire Lagasse, who did the catering, and also Rubiso Winery, who provided the wine. And we have a sign-up sheet in the back. If you are currently not getting our email announcements now, please sign the list, but if you are getting them, you don't need to sign the list because you're already on it. We also have some of our colloquium brochures, Water Resources Center Archives brochures, and also Clearinghouse for Dam Removal brochures, which in the back. And we also have some other things that have our website and contact information on it. So with that, I will turn it back to Matt.
Thanks. So, you know, when you're on an airplane and they say, if you're not a member of our mileage program, you can sign up now and get credit for this flight. We also, if you're a Berkeley student, we also have a seminar that is built around the Colloquium series. It's called California Water and Interdisciplinary Seminar. And the requirements are to attend these colloquia, so there's 4 each semester, and do readings, and then attend meetings that are essentially in between the colloquia. And we discuss the readings and the topics of the talks. So if you're interested in doing that, you could even get credit for attending today. I'm running that seminar this term. You could get in touch with me, or probably the easiest thing when the sign-up sheet goes around, make an indication that you want to do that. So to introduce our speaker this evening, there's probably no topic in environment or water in California that is as hot right now as the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And that was one of the ships about to crash into a levee and start a levee break. In January 2006, Governor Schwarzenegger appointed a Delta Vision Task Force, a group of 7 people on an advisory board created by this executive order, directed to develop policy recommendations to the governor and the legislature addressing the environmental problems currently confronting the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which are myriad. Our speaker today, Rick Frank, is a member of that board. He was one of the 7 appointed by the governor. The task force has been moving forward, and Rick will describe their progress. He's also executive director of the California Center for Environmental Law and Policy at the Berkeley Law School, Boat Law School. The center focuses on applied scholarship and public policy initiatives in the field of environmental, natural resources, energy, and land use law. He also serves as a lecturer at the law school and teaches courses in environmental law, climate change, and affirmative litigation. His expertise is in environmental law, land use, energy issues, property rights, and legal ethics. And he's author of The Takings Issue, Constitutional Limits on Land Use Control and Environmental Regulation. Before coming to the center in Berkeley, Rick practiced law with federal and state agencies for 32 years, most of the time with the California Department of Justice. Immediately before coming to Bolt, he served as California's Chief Deputy Attorney General for Legal Affairs. So he brings a broad experience to the topic, and we look forward to hearing about the state of the Delta. Rick, thanks for joining us.
All right. Whoa. Clearly going to need some help here. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Matt. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to the Water Archives, Water Center, and you and your colleagues, Joe Sachs and others, with whom I've worked for many years and for whom I have a great deal of admiration. And a shameless plug, my own center is one of the sponsors of this series and has been in the past, so I hope that's not doesn't qualify as inside dealing. My background as it relates to the Delta and the Delta Vision process is kind of interesting, or at least I found it kind of interesting, because as Matt said, I've really spent most of my career working as a lawyer for the state of California and various state agencies that have a variety of responsibilities relating to the Delta. So I've been kind of behind the scenes guy, providing advice to those regulators and decision makers, and when things careen off the tracks and litigation has evolved, I'm kind of the legal equivalent of the fellow who sweeps up after the circus parade and has handled litigation on a variety of topics related to the Delta. And on behalf of a number of state agencies, specifically focusing on the Delta and Sassoon Marsh, which, depending on who you talk to, is either part of San Francisco Bay or the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. The three main agencies I worked with before I came full-time to UC Berkeley were the California State Lands Commissions, which owns the bed and banks of California's navigable waterways, a substantial amount of real estate in terms of environmental value and acreage, the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and most recently, in kind of a bridge from a long-term Delta governance past to what may be the future, a relatively new agency as state governments go, the California Delta Protection Commission, which was the product of legislation, the Delta Protection Act, enacted by the California legislature in 1992, and really for the first time, albeit in a very modest and incremental set of steps, decided that within the Delta there were some regional and statewide values that warranted a regional approach with respect to land use issues in the Delta, at least, moving beyond the tradition, longstanding tradition and fiercely held in some quarters tradition of local control over land use decisions in the Delta. And while relatively late in my career at the Attorney General's office, I must say that helping get the legislation enacted, creating the Delta Protection Commission, and then working as that commission's first counsel was one of the more rewarding parts of my job with the California Attorney General's office. Well, so that's my background. I've been here at UC Berkeley at the law school and heading the California Center for Environmental Law and Policy now for just about 2 years, and it was only shortly after I got here and figured out where Worcester Hall is in relation to Bolt Hall and that sort of thing that I was appointed to the Delta Vision Task Force. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today with the circumstances that precipitated the creation of the Delta Vision Task Force, the Delta Vision process, what we've done so far, where we're likely headed, and then make some perhaps bold and rash predictions as to the future of the Delta Vision process and more importantly, the future of the the California Delta itself, which is, among many of its attributes, the largest estuary on the west coast of either North or South America. I really plan to spend my time here with you today, and Matt, you're going to have to give me the high sign when I'm getting short of time. Give me the vaudeville hook. Really a four-part presentation. First of all, I'm going to talk, let's expand a little bit more on Matt's remarks about the origins of Delta Vision. Second, give you an overview of what we've done so far, and specifically the so-called vision for the Delta adopted by the task force in late 2007. Talk then about the current work we're doing in our second phase of our assigned responsibilities. And then fourth and finally, do that crystal ball exercise and some prognosticating about the Delta and the future of the estuary. Well, okay, beginnings of Delta Vision. As Matt said, in 2006, Governor Schwarzenegger signed an executive order, which I think was quite direct, and as this governor is prone to be, quite explicit and blunt about the various ills plaguing the Delta as an ecosystem, as a water delivery system, as a cultural resource. And he made the point, with which very few people have disagreed, no one really, that the Delta is in a serious multifaceted crisis, whether it's viewed as a plumbing system, as an ecosystem, as an agricultural resource, as a cultural icon. It is under severe threat. It is also plagued by a paralysis of governance or ineffective governance, multifaceted and overlapping governance, and that was an explicit part of the governor's findings in creating the task force. So in part to address that, the governor did what politicians and policymakers have a time-honored tradition of doing both here in California and in other jurisdictions and nationally, and that is, what do? You create a task force. You create an advisory board to provide you with advice. And that is what the Delta Vision Task Force is all about. It's a 7-member entity to which that has been charged with the governor, and to use his words in the executive order, to develop a durable vision for the sustainable management of the Delta over the long term, and to restore and maintain identified functions and values that are important to the Delta's environmental quality and economic and social well-being of the state. And you see just from the executive order kind of the multifaceted demands upon the Delta, expectations of the Delta, and how those have in many ways come into conflict. Okay, well, who are the members of the task force? You already know about me, but there are 6 other members, and I think this is one of the things I like about this governor, is that he is truly more bipartisan than we've expected most of our governors to be. The members of the task force, we have Democrats, we have Republicans, we have political independents. It's a very diverse group in many ways. Our chair is Phil Eisenberg, a Democrat from the Sacramento area, former mayor of Sacramento, former member of the State Assembly, representing the Sacramento area, and one of the most cogent political and policy thinkers that I know. And that's our chair. Another member, Sonny McPeak. Sonny is actually a former classmate of mine at UC Santa Barbara back in the Pleistocene age, where we both got our undergraduate degrees. Since then, she has gone on to great things. She was a supervisor in Contra Costa County and served for Governor Schwarzenegger in his cabinet as Secretary for Business and Transportation, and is now in the private sector. William Riley, another Republican who served with distinction as President Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 1, or I guess Bush 39, is it? Or 41, I guess. As administrator of the United States Environmental Protection Agency under the senior President Bush, and a very thoughtful individual. Tom McKernan, a businessman from Southern California who serves as CEO of the Automobile Association of Southern California. Monica Florian, a retired executive of the Irvine Corporation, who's done some very interesting and innovative things with respect to ecosystem planning and the NCCP process in Southern California. And then, last but not least, a colleague of mine here on the Berkeley faculty, Raymond Seed, who is a professor of engineering here at UC Berkeley and one of the nation's foremost experts on levee safety and levee maintenance, and his expertise has been extremely helpful as we've gone forward. That's one of the embarrassing factoids about the Delta Vision process. It's almost embarrassingly dominated by UC Berkeley. Phil Eisenberg, our chair, is a graduate, I think both an undergraduate of UC Berkeley and got his law degree here, and then Ray Seed and I are both teaching here in our day jobs, and so it's interesting to work with them in that capacity. All right, so those are the people, and it's a very, as I say, diverse group, and thrown together in this process. We were appointed in February of 2007. And we got to work immediately. The governor in his executive order gave us 2 discrete tasks, and with very short deadlines for both of them. We were appointed in February. We were told to start meeting and deliberating in March of 2007, and by the end of calendar year 2007 to adopt a vision for the Delta and a sustainable future for the Delta by December 31st, 2007. He wasn't about to release us from our servitude after doing that. However, the second component of our task upon which we're engaged at the moment is to fashion a strategic plan designed to implement that vision statement and provide more discrete and specific policy recommendations to the governor, his cabinet, and to the California legislature. That duty was required by the executive order to be completed by October 31st of this year. So we had, after adopting the vision statement, we were given another 10 months to conclude that work. We have our penultimate meeting, set of hearings next Thursday and Friday, and our last meetings are scheduled in October. And the one thing I can state categorically to you about the Delta Vision process, we will finish our work on time pursuant to the governor's executive order, despite the fact that various interest groups have suggested that, well, we ought to take a little bit longer and delay our recommendations for this or that reason. And we're not going to do that. We're going to take the governor and his executive order at their word and hit our marks and finish our recommendations on time. 2 important caveats about the Delta Vision Task Force. First of all, we have no political power whatsoever. We are purely an advisory entity. We have the power of persuasion and nothing else. We make our recommendations and present them to the governor and to the legislature, and then we melt away. And that's the second point. We are a transitory interim entity. We disappear like Cinderella's coach on October 31st. Of this year. And then it's going to be up to the legislature, the governor, and interested stakeholders is the currently politically correct term, interest groups who have a stake in the Delta, economic, philosophical, or otherwise, to see that those recommendations are adopted, rejected, or modified. Okay. Well, so we got to work in March of 2007, and between then and November of last year, we held 14 days of public hearings over that 9-month period. We were supported in that effort by a 43-member stakeholder group, which represented virtually every constituency that is interested in the Delta for one reason or another. This was an outgrowth of, in many ways, of the Cal-Fed process, which was a longer-term effort designed to, through a consensus-based process, to develop recommendations and policy advancements for the Delta. That task force met for 15 days on its own over the same period and provided its own recommendations to the task force. We also understood from the get-go, as did the governor through his executive order, the importance of science, good science as a basis for recommendations, and we were served by a very talented group of scientific experts, many of whom are based here at UC Berkeley or on other UC Berkeley campuses. The chair of that scientific advisory committee is Professor Jeff Mount, professor of geology at UC Davis, and a very thoughtful individual who's thought long and hard about many of these issues. I'm happy to say, relatively unknown to government, we actually finished on budget and early. We adopted our vision statement by a unanimous vote of the 7 members, which I think is critically important for political reasons, and I can get into that in more detail, when we met in November of last year. What did that vision statement, and I have visual aids here. I'll give you at the end of my talk the link to the website where you can find all of these materials, but this is what the vision statement that we adopted last November looks like in hard copy form. We decided we resisted the temptation to go on and on in a long document that would be turgid and wind up unread and left and gathering dust on someone's bookshelf. We decided to make a succinct, short vision statement that hopefully would resonate and actually be read and considered by folks. So we did that, and the centerpiece of the vision statement are 12 recommendations for long-term reforms with respect to the Delta and remediation efforts for the Delta, and 7 near-term actions. And an important threshold point that we made both when we adopted the vision statement last November and in the report itself, in the vision itself, is that it is important to the success of our efforts. Our view is that if these recommendations are going to be adopted, they need to be adopted as a whole. As I'll discuss in a moment, there are aspects of the report that I'm sure found favor with environmental organizations and interest, and were met with a great deal of heartburn by water interests. And conversely, the opposite is true with respect to other recommendations. And what we thought would just perpetuate the cycle of controversy and inaction would be decision makers who cherry-picked from our list of recommendations those recommendations with which they agreed and ignored those with which they disagreed. That's a prescription for inaction and nothing happening. So we said, take it or leave it, but consider it as a whole. Okay, so what is the vision statement? I'm going to go through the recommendations one at a time, some given this audience and your interest in water issues in more detail than others. The first recommendation, I think, is the most important and is really the overarching constitutional principle, if you will, underlying the vision statement, and that was that the Delta ecosystem and a reliable water supply are the primary co-equal goals for a sustainable management of the Delta. We've been hearing, we heard throughout our deliberations, as you've heard in many contexts, that it's either an either-or situation, that we're either going to save the Delta, preserve the Delta ecosystem, or we're going to use it as a water delivery system. And we said we've got to find a way and a set of strategies that do both, because it's both politically, economically, and environmentally unsustainable to pick one over the other. Second recommendation, and this is something I was just talking to Professor Hap Dunning, my own water law and environmental professor when I went to law school longer ago than either of us would want to admit, just before this talk. And that is the fact that the California Delta in many ways is underappreciated, undiscovered, and deserves greater prominence, greater recognition, and greater protection. Our second recommendation is that the California Delta is a unique and valued area warranting recognition and special legal status from the state of California, and since we've talked about from the federal government as well. Just a thought about this. When you think about California and its environmental resources, you think of Lake Tahoe and the Sierras and the coast, the California coast, and generally the Delta has not risen to that level, but it really is a fabulous place for those of you who've lived or worked or recreated in that area. One of the things that came out through our deliberations, our hearing process last year, and I can't recall for the life of me who made this point, but it really resonated with me, is that as we look at California's population growth, 37 million people and growing and counting, we see tremendous encroachment upon the estuary system that is the Delta from the west, the greater San Francisco Bay Area, from the north, the Sacramento region where I make my home, from the east and south, Stockton, that area, some of the highest and most fastest growing areas in the state, all encroaching on the Delta. Well, what if we looked upon the Delta as kind of the regional equivalent of what Central Park is to the citizens of greater New York, an area that is set aside for long-term preservation, for use for recreation, for ecosystem preservation, as a cultural laboratory and museum, if you will. And that metaphor, that analogy really resonated with me, and I think with my colleagues on the task force. So we'll talk more about where we're going with that, but that's a really important thing. I think maybe the PR component of our work to try and elevate the status and recognition of the Delta, both in terms of Californians individually and collectively. Third recommendation, that the Delta ecosystem must function as an integral part of a healthy estuary. The idea that we need a more multifaceted ecosystem than the Delta has been managed as being a diverse and changing habitat mosaic is one of the phrases coming out of our report, and to promote a productive estuary system that reduces one of the key biological threats to the Delta, and that's a succession of invasive species that have fundamentally and unfortunately probably irreparably changed the ecosystem and environmental values of the Delta. All right. Recommendations 4 through 8 are probably particularly relevant to this group and your interest, because here we're focusing on water issues specifically. A key point, and I think Task Force member Bill Riley, the former U.S. EPA administrator, has kind of been our moral leader in this regard, is really to put water conservation front and center. And read carefully or listen carefully to this recommendation. California's water supply is limited and must be managed with significantly more efficiency to be adequate for its future population, growing economy, and vital environment. Notice we don't talk about the Delta water supply in this context. We talk about California's water supply. That is intentional. That water conservation, not just within the Delta watershed, but on a statewide basis, is a critical component to fixing the multiple ills that plague the Delta. Conservation, we believe, is really a cornerstone principle to any successful fix of the multiple ills that have befallen the Delta. A key component of this conservation effort is increased regional self-sufficiency in various parts of California, not relying from great distances upon the Delta as the be-all and end-all water source. And conservation is really, and again, another term I think from our vision statement, should be the ethic underlying water policy, not only for the Delta, but in California. And you've heard this from various forums. In my hometown newspaper, the Sacramento Bee, Peter Glick, head of the Pacific Institute, wrote a very thoughtful editorial today, which makes the same point. By the way, there are a number of visual aids that are on this PowerPoint slides. These are taken directly from the vision statement, and I don't have time, and the font size doesn't permit thoughtful sharing of that information, but I commend those to your attention to the extent you want to get into these. There are a lot of very interesting dynamics and points to be made in those graphs and exhibits from the vision statement. Well, here's where we get to some of the more politically controversial areas, and this next recommendation is one that I take primarily responsibility for injecting into the Delta Vision process. I've got the scar tissue to prove it, and probably going to generate some more before the end of October, that the foundation for policymaking about California's water resources must be the longstanding principles of reasonable use and public trust, and these principles are especially relevant and applicable to the Delta. Reasonable use doctrine is codified in our state constitution explicitly in Article 10, Section 2, adopted by voter initiative in the 1920s following a politically unpopular California Supreme Court decision. And it requires, in short, that all uses of water in California be reasonable. And what that means is subject to judicial interpretation and regulators' application, but it's an important overarching principle of water law. The public trust doctrine, as many of the people in this room know far better than I, is of even greater history than that. It goes back to the founding of the state in 1850, and this is, by the way, this is Admission Day. California was admitted to the Union 158 years ago today, so let's party. The public trust doctrine came out of in many ways, out of the first major environmental dispute in the history of the state of California, the battle over hydraulic mining in the gold rush era, particularly in the 1860s. After the easy diggings played out, hydraulic mining was used to go after the more deeply embedded gold through these water cannons that, through tremendous use of force, really blew apart the mother lode country and turned some very scenic areas in the Sierra foothills into rubble. That rubble with flood season would flow out of the mountains and out of the foothills into our river system, clogged the riverbeds of all the major rivers of Northern California, and caused enormous havoc, flooding throughout the Sacramento Valley, doing considerable damage to the then nascent agricultural industry in California that, of course, has since grown to become California's most important industry in terms of economic power. That culminated, as these resource disputes often do, in litigation and in two major decisions, one in federal court and one in state court in 1884, in which judges and justices shut down the hydraulic mining industry in California as a public nuisance, really fundamentally changed the history, the economic and political history of California, and really ended the province of the mining industry, elevated the agricultural industry, and most important for this purpose, really in those two decisions, which are often overlooked, really first talked about the public trust doctrine. And what does it say? The public trust doctrine, in short, says that certain resources, the beds of navigable waterways, fish and wildlife, and more recently water as a consumptive resource, are peculiarly public in nature, are incapable of private ownership, and that government decision makers and regulators have an affirmative obligation to manage and preserve those resources for the benefit of future generations. It seems to me and to my colleagues on the task force that this doctrine plays out with particular force in the Delta. It's the law professor's perfect exam question. You have wildlife species, you have water as a consumptive resource, you've got wetlands, you've got any number of resources that courts have established are subject to the public trust doctrine at risk. And our view is that those resources are deserving of heightened protection under the public trust doctrine. I'll come back to this more because this has become a bit of a third rail issue with respect to our subsequent deliberations. A related recommendation, the goals of conservation previously discussed, efficiency and sustainable use, should and must drive California water policies in the future, both with respect to the Delta and statewide. All right, this is one of those recommendations that I think heartened environmentalists and gave a fair amount of discomfort to what are sometimes referred to as the water buffaloes and water community. A revitalized Delta ecosystem will require reduced diversions or changes in patterns and timings of diversions upstream, within the Delta, and exported from the Delta at critical times. And there are a few nuggets I want to mine from this recommendation because I think it's really important. Traditionally, and certainly when I recall the peripheral canal debate in 1982, that was the last time we looked at the peripheral canal in a systematic way, was looking at it on the ballot in 1982 here in California. The focus was on Northern California versus Southern California. Northern California is talking about how a peripheral canal might result in the diversion and stealing of our water, and that the problem was south of Delta interest, those exporting water from the Delta. The task force, in its vision statement, doesn't buy that paradigm. Thinks that's an overly simplistic attitude. Our view, borne out by the data in our view, is that upstream water diversions, in Delta water diversions, and exports from the Delta are all to blame. All have historically and continue to contribute to the environmental problems faced by the Delta. And again, it's oftentimes not too popular here in the Bay Area to talk about this, but there's a certain amount of hypocrisy, in my view, from folks, particularly in the Bay Area, who benefit from, in San Francisco, from Hetch Hetchy, the first peripheral canal built in California's history, and more recently the East Bay Mud diversions from the McCollumney River that go right through the Delta, that reduce the amount of runoff that would otherwise flow to and through the Delta. So our point is that everyone is responsible, everybody's to blame, everybody's got to be part of the solution, and that we are in, to quote former Governor, now Attorney General Jerry Brown, a fundamental era of limits. There's a finite amount of water. We've tapped out the system, particularly in the estuary, and something's got to give. And what's going to give is either reduced diversions from the Delta, or at a minimum, as we say, we've got to think about changing somewhat substantially the manner of diversions if we're going to continue to divert from the Delta. Again, more on that later, but just one interesting fact that we learned in our deliberations in 2007, and this is documented in the vision statement. As remarkable as it may seem, historically, over the last 25 years, the state of California and the federal government operating the Central Valley Project are exporting more water from the Delta in drought years and dry years than in wet years. You don't need a postgraduate degree in hydrology to realize that's nuts. That's just nuts. It makes no sense. That again, that's a simple example of what's wrong with the way we're currently managing Delta water shortages, but it's an important one. Now, here's where the water contractors and the water interests were heartened, and the environmentalists got a little cranky with us, because we took the position that new facilities for conveyance and storage and better linkage between storage and conveyance facilities are necessary to better manage California's water resources, the Delta estuary system, and exports from the Delta. There are those who believe, and the aforementioned Peter Glick is a prominent example of this, that we can conserve our way out of the water shortages that loom across California and across California's population. And while I have enormous respect for Peter and the work that he does and the recommendations that he makes, I'm not of that view for a number of reasons. One, dealing with the demographics and the projections, population growth, but some other factors that I'm going to get into in a moment. The tougher question is, are we talking about, in terms of storage, additional groundwater storage as opposed to surface water? And you can have, and we can have, and certainly will have principal debates over that, but it is the task force view that we need to rethink and expand our storage options and better link storage and conveyance, which are not terribly well coordinated now. Okay, a lot of money has been thrown at infrastructure, and including Delta infrastructure of late, particularly in the 2006 election, with the infrastructure bonds being approved in Proposition 84. And our ninth recommendation just makes what I think is a pretty commonsensical point. Hey, let's not just throw money willy-nilly, let's have a plan. And we are perhaps immodestly saying that the expenditures from those bonds, those billions of dollars that are going to be spent on levees, on water supply systems, and on environmental remediation, there ought to be an overarching plan, and maybe you ought to look, among other places, at what we're recommending here through the Delta Vision process. Okay, recommendation number 10, failure of governance. Another thing that just about everybody agreed from the scores and perhaps hundreds of people who testified before us in 2007 is that the existing Delta governance system is broken. We heard testimony that there are over 200 state, regional, and local entities that claim some jurisdiction over some aspects of the Delta. Many of these are single-purpose agencies, leading to the conclusion that everyone has jurisdiction over the Delta, but no one is in charge. That's got to be fixed. This is another fairly controversial recommendation. We say that we're going to have to go back to the drawing boards and come up with an uber agency, some sort of large statewide and powerful and well-funded entity to regain control and provide effective governance and regulation and leadership with respect to the Delta. Okay, as another thing that I did for 30 plus years in the Attorney General's office, a lot of land use law. And so this recommendation number 11 is another one that I plead guilty to in terms of getting this on our agenda. One of the first things we did, and was very, very useful to us when we started the Delta Vision process, and if you're ever doing something similar, I would strongly suggest you do it, and that is do a site visit. Go to the place that you're studying, researching, making policy decisions regarding, and we spent a couple of days doing a land tour of the Delta, and then we got on a Black Hawk helicopter, courtesy of the California National Guard, and did an aerial, very detailed aerial survey of the Delta. And you see you're able to connect dots and understand some ecological and political and land use relationships better than you would otherwise. And during that helicopter tour, we saw very vividly the urban encroachment into the Delta, Discovery Bay, a subdivision process which, by today's standard, probably should never have been built and is really plopped down right in the middle of the delta behind very fragile levees, and we have a couple thousand people very much in harm's way. Town of Oakley, growing up from Contra Costa County right up abutting the delta, very, very fragile levees. And some existing political debates and challenges over land use practices that are going on right now. In Clarksburg, at the north end of the delta, the so-called Sugar Mill project that included new residential subdivisions behind agricultural, fragile, and eroding levees. The town of Lathrop, just a suburb of Stockton, proposed to build major development in a floodplain, the San Joaquin River floodplain, at the same time that there's been 18-year litigation to restore flows to the San Joaquin River and restore to some degree that riverine system. And even within the delta, the town of Ileton, which is one of the core delta communities, if you look at their general plan, they plan to build subdivisions right in the middle of the delta. They have a very ambitious plan, which again strikes me as a not so objective observer as crazy. You know, we've got to learn some lessons. It's interesting, you know, 3 years after Hurricane Katrina and the lessons learned in the Ninth Ward and elsewhere. I had an opportunity through my work here at the center at UC Berkeley to travel to New Orleans earlier this year and see the continuing devastation and economic and social disorder that still exists in New Orleans as a result of Katrina. And with that in mind, it's interesting to note another point that came up in our deliberations, that according to the U.S. Geological Survey, the only part of the country, the only region of the country that was at greater risk of major flooding than was New Orleans was the Sacramento Valley in and around the Delta. More at a greater risk of flooding than New Orleans, and the only place in the country, in the nation, that is. So with that in mind, long wind-up to this pitch, my view is this encroaching urbanization, building new subdivisions, adding new residential development into an area that is just not suitable for that kind of permanent residential occupation is folly and should be discouraged. And 12th and finally, acknowledging the fact, as our scientific advisors did, that there are a tremendous amount of continuing uncertainties about the ecology of the delta, the hydrology, and we've got to be nimble as we go forward in our governance recommendations and other recommendations. And this is really embracing, as part of the Delta Vision process, adaptive management principles and comparing them to the existing systems, and this is true of the engineering systems of the Delta. It's equally true of the regulatory systems. They're currently extremely brittle. They're the opposite of adaptive management, and we really need to fundamentally change that. And any recommendations that go forward in terms of reforms to the Delta ecosystem, water delivery systems, and what have you, really incorporate in a fair amount of flexibility and an opportunity to evolve in response to new scientific information and the like. Okay, at the same time we were going through these deliberations, several other people were doing work, and you may want to talk about that during the Q&A period, but I don't have time to go through them in detail now. But the one set of research findings that I do want to bring to your attention, albeit briefly, are those of the Public Policy Institute of California, also based here in the East Bay. PPIC has published two important studies related to the Delta. One came out in February of 2007, just as the task force was beginning its work envisioning futures for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And this really explored in some detail various alternatives that have been thrown out for the future of the Delta, talking about how some of those made sense economically, ecologically, and some did not, and really narrowed some of the options that are theoretically existing into a more manageable set of options that our task force and other policy makers and policy advisors could look at. I thought it was very useful and very, very important kind of foundational work for our activity. Just 2 months ago, PPIC dropped the other shoe, a related report comparing futures for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And I think it's fair to say this report has generated a little bit more controversy than the prior report, because this one focuses primarily on water supply, water exports, and comes to the conclusion, and I should tell you who in this case PPIC is, Ellen Hannock, who's a research fellow at the PPIC working closely with a series of scientists and academics at the University of California at Davis, the aforementioned Jeff Mount, who also advised us, and several other professors of geology and resource economics and others. And they come to the conclusion, well, I should tell you, first of all, they say with respect to water exports from the Delta, there are really four options: to continue transporting water through the Delta using the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project, a peripheral canal, an alternate conveyance is the polite term for it, a dual conveyance using both through Delta conveyance and an around the Delta conveyance, which is what, by the way, parenthetically, our Delta Vision Task Force thought was the best or maybe the least bad option to pursue, at least theoretically. And fourth and finally, to end pumping altogether from the Delta. And the PPIC, going through those initiatives, came to the conclusion that both from an economic perspective and from an environmental perspective, an alternate conveyance facility made the most sense. And that has, as you might imagine, generated a fair amount of controversy. Okay. With that digression, turning back to the Delta Vision Task Force, as I said, we issued our report at the end of November of last year, and I kind of was unsure what the public reaction would be, and I was very pleasantly surprised, as were my colleagues, that the public reaction and the media reaction to it was almost uniformly favorable from the water community, from environmentalists. We got very nice editorials from virtually every major newspaper in the state, and so we were feeling pretty good about ourselves. Fast forward to 2008, when we've begun our work on the strategic plan, which again is part two of our duty, and the obligation to make explicit and specific the implementing strategies to carry out the vision. It's been a bumpier ride. A lot more turbulence and more not the consensus and degree of support that we enjoyed in 2007. And frankly, I didn't predict that it would be any differently. But the next stage that we actually started in promptly in January of 2008 is developing a strategic plan to implement the vision. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, simply because I'd be glad to talk about it during the Q&A period, simply because the task force members have not acted to adopt a strategic plan. I don't think we will take a vote until the October meeting. We are looking at staff drafts. I know a number of you have reviewed those staff drafts of the strategic plan, and it is an iterative process between the task force members and our staff as we go through their drafts and we help refine them. But we have not, and I think this is an important point to underscore, we have not adopted a strategic plan yet, and I, for one, don't know how I'm going to vote on several components of it, and won't for at least another month. Okay, some key themes that we do agree as we go forward with the strategic plan, that we ought to look at the Delta not as an extractive resource, but in terms of a sustainable resource, that we shouldn't look at the Delta and ecosystem restoration efforts as mitigation for water conveyance, as a means to an end, that we really ought to dig in and look at the Delta ecosystem as revitalization of a precious resource of continuing importance to 37 million Californians, and not simply a tit-for-tat mitigation for environmental harm that policymakers may choose to inflict through water conveyance or other strategies. Not abandonment of the Delta. There's been some talk in some quarters we ought to abandon the Delta, just let the levees fail and walk away from it. That, for a variety of reasons, doesn't seem to us to be a terribly viable or appropriate option. And fourth, consistency, not chaos. By that we mean trying to be more proactive in terms of managing the Delta. I think right now, and I'm editorializing only on behalf of myself at this point, I think one of the things we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years is we've seen a Delta governance system and legal system that is purely reactive. We don't have much strategic thinking. We don't have much programmatic thinking. We are lurching from crisis to crisis and lawsuit to lawsuit, and that is not an effective means of addressing any or all of these concerns. As we go forward, water supply and water quality. These are some of the things that we're looking at, some of the points, bullet points here that I won't go through. But again, increased efficiencies, water conservation, we're not going to lose track of that theme. Now I want to talk a little bit about political science and one of the epiphanies that I've had. Again, working for the state of California and doing some water litigation over the last 30 or 40 years and living most of my life in Northern California. As I mentioned before, the evil empire of water we traditionally thought of, or I at least was schooled to think of, was the Metropolitan Water District, the city of L.A., the battle for Mono Lake, Westlands Water District. And I think, that's historically there's a fair amount of evidence to support that. What has really been interesting to me, and really has been an epiphany of sorts, is to see how water interests, with respect to the Delta at least, how the alliances have shifted and how approaches have changed. And again, I'm just talking for myself, so don't quote me in terms of here representing my other 6 colleagues. I can only speak for myself on this. I have to say, and this has been a great surprise to me, that in terms of both the vision statement and our work to date on the strategic plan, the point that we're going to have to limit and reduce water diversions from the Delta, et cetera, have met with support, albeit grudging support, from the Metropolitan Water District and even the Westlands Water District, which has been a very pleasant surprise for me. Conversely, and more disappointing, the people who have been most cranky, obdurate, difficult, whatever you want to call it, have been my colleagues and neighbors in Northern California, interestingly, the north of Delta interests, many of whom believe that, the Delta's broken, Delta's got problems, but it's not our problem, and we have no moral or economic or legal obligation to contribute to the fix, which, again, is a view, a worldview, a regional view that I don't share, and I don't think my colleagues do as well. But it's been very difficult, and when I point out to them that in terms of the water quality problems befalling the Delta, a lot of that is attributable to ag waste and pesticide deposition, and in the case of my hometown in Sacramento, the deposition of wastewater treatment byproducts, ammonia, that are harming the ecosystem, and the fact that a lot of the diversions from the Sacramento Valley and north are, as I said before, depriving the Delta of water flows that would otherwise get there. That's just a mindset that they're not buying. And the other thing that I find quite interesting, returning to this issue of reasonable use and public trust doctrine. I mean, these seem like truisms to me. I learned them from my professor, that these are embedded explicitly in the state constitution. Some of these public trust doctrine is a product, as I said, of 140 years of federal and state court decisions. And it's interesting, the reaction of many of the water interests, primarily in Northern California now, not in the San Joaquin Valley and not in the far south, that they view the invocation of public trust and reasonable use principles in 2008 with abject horror. And I've actually been lobbied by folks, you've got to take any reference to the public trust doctrine and reasonable use principles out of your strategic plan. And I say, or else what? And the response is, without quoting about it, well, basically, we're going to hold our breath and cause all sorts of problems, which strikes me as a not terribly constructive or informed approach. So we'll see how this plays out, but it's very interesting. And again, one other thing with respect to Southern versus Northern California, and I think particularly speaking to a Northern California audience worthy of note, conservation and conservation ethic. It has, folks, I've got to tell you, it's been far more effectively and firmly and enthusiastically been embraced on a regional basis by our Southern California neighbors than it has been in Northern California. And my hometown of Sacramento is, again, probably one of the most flagrant negative examples until recently. Well, it still has in its city charters that you can't have water meters in Sacramento. Fortunately, from my view, we finally passed state legislation which preempted that idiotic rule. But conversely, and on a more positive note, I think water districts and local water districts in Southern California have really led the way in terms of some very cutting-edge and effective water conservation strategies. And I think that we in Northern California have a lot to learn. So So the dynamics, the 1982 North versus South approach, to me, doesn't work anymore for any number of reasons, and it's a much more nuanced and sophisticated effort. Water conveyance proposals, the Department of Water Resources has not waited, and the governor have not waited for our recommendations. They are going ahead with preliminary work under the California Environmental Quality Act to do engineering studies and do environmental review for proposed routes, alternate, the current nomenclature is alternate conveyance as opposed to peripheral canal, but various routes are being scoped out and will be in probably the mother of all environmental documents that will be published probably in 2009. Well, we already talked about water storage. I want to just mention briefly two wild cards that I think are important that I haven't talked about explicitly yet, that are going to make our deliberations more difficult, that make ultimate policymaker decisions on the future of the Delta more difficult, and really kind of add to the mix. One is climate change, and a related point is the current drought, which is probably going to be a perpetual drought. Climate change affects the Delta in two very important ways from two different directions. We have the issue of sea level rise, and I didn't think to include it in my PowerPoint presentation, but there's a very powerful illustration in the vision statement that shows the effect of a 1 meter rise in sea level on Delta territories, and it will expand substantially the area of the Delta that's subject to inundation. And as you probably all know, looking to the east, climate change has already been documented by the Department of Water Resources and a variety of experts as disrupting and fundamentally altering runoff patterns, less snowpack, which means higher runoff, water runoff in the winter months, which puts additional stress on this fragile and eroding levee system that intersects the deltas. So you have these convergent forces of climate change, sea level rise, and increased flood flows in a shorter period of time, putting additional stress on the delta and making even less sustainable an ecosystem that already is in trouble. Another not climate change based fact, but another one that is revealed in our report. USGS studies reveal that the chances of a substantial earthquake in the next 30 years that will take out multiple levees and submerge numerous islands, not a single island or two, but numerous islands, is 2 out of 3. There's a 67% chance that in the next 30 years we're going to have a catastrophic earthquake that will take out the Delta as we know it, and certainly as a water conveyance system render it inoperable. And we're talking about consequences there in terms of disrupted water supplies, leaving in the tens of billions of dollars. So another fairly sober approach. The other aspect, which is certainly tied to climate change, is drought situation. We're in a drought now. The meteorologists think it's going to be tough going for at least another year or two. And most of the long-term scientific studies say as a result of climate change, particularly in most parts of California, including the Delta, we are going to be in a long-term era of scarcity of water, of precipitation, and potential permanent drought. Okay. Well, a couple things I want to talk about in terms of what we are thinking about in our strategic plan on the governance issue. One of the more controversial aspects of what we're proposing. We are proposing, I think we're going to propose an overarching state agency. It may not come out with the name of California Delta and Ecosystem and Water Council, but something like it. That a state-based entity that has overarching regulatory powers for water and terrestrial resources. One of the less controversial aspects of our governance proposal, I'm certain we will propose creation of a Delta Conservancy to acquire and manage public lands and conservation lands in the Delta. That model has worked extremely well at Lake Tahoe on the coast and in other areas of ecological and environmental importance. So I think we'll do that. Strengthening the Delta Protection Commission, which I talked about, created in 1992. Product of a political compromise. It was a useful first step, but it was fairly weak land use powers. And in order to address in an effective way some of these land use challenges and urban encroachment challenges, we're talking about putting the Delta Protection Commission on steroids and giving it some additional heightened power to limit untoward development in the Delta. And have to adopt sustainable financing tools to make sure we can pay for all this and preserve and protect the Delta. And then a key thing we found, again, as a former litigator, that there are a lot of laws that we have on the books that are simply not being enforced with respect to water diversions, illegal land developments and disruptions. And so part of this, and I guess I sound like the younger President Bush here in some cases, sometimes we ought to think more about enforcing the laws we already have. That's not a panacea, but that, particularly with respect to some of the ills that face the Delta, I think that's important, whether we're talking about the State Water Board or the local zoning commissioner. Well, I've already talked mainly. I'll just go through this quickly and see if there are any other things I want to talk about specifically related to the water as we go forward on the strategic plan. I think that these issues of public trust and reasonable use are going to be a bit of a philosophical battleground over the next couple months. And I say, bring it on. It's an important enough battle to have. I think this is an important principle to retain as part of the strategic plan, just as it is in the vision statement. And if that's a fight we have to have with certain interests, I think it's a fight worth taking on. I guess I would only editorialize to say this is nothing innovative, radical, or as I was accused once at a presentation, Soviet-style planning. These are cornerstone principles of California water law that have existed for decades or centuries. I will say, for those of you who are mavens of California water law, the principle that has been invoked in opposition to invocation of public trust and reasonable use principles is the area of origin doctrine. This is a very interesting principle of California water law that, again, others in the room know far better than I. But it basically reserves for areas where water originates through precipitation patterns some legal right to some portion of that water for the future needs of that region or county, which take precedence over potential for the uses of that water in other parts of the state. The area of origin doctrine has been characterized by some as the sleeping giant of water rights law, and having seen how it's being invoked in connection with our deliberations, I think that's probably accurate. I would say, however, and I think the one thing we know, that the parameters of the area of origin doctrine are relatively unexplored in the courts. We've had a couple recent decisions, but mainly you have some statutes that have been enacted some time ago that have not been interpreted too much. But I believe it's fair to say that the area of origin doctrine, which is statutory in nature, is subject to and limited by, as appropriate, the reasonable use and public trust principles. I'm not sure everybody agrees with that, but I think that's a fair statement of the law. Let me talk briefly about litigation, and this is where I've become a heretic. I'm a recovering attorney. Now I'm an academic. I don't practice law anymore, or not much. One of the top environmental professors in the country, Jody Freeman, who teaches environmental law at Harvard these days, was at a conference we sponsored a year or two ago, and she made a very important point, and that is litigation is not policy. Litigation is not policy making. And I think she's right. She wasn't talking about the Delta, but it certainly is true. Litigation is inherently limited as a tool of policy making. It is reactive. It is single issue in nature. And for those who think, well, we can ignore strategic planning processes like Delta Vision or whatever they may be in favor of, we'll just go to the mattresses and put on our litigation armor and go litigate. I suggest, as someone who did that for a living for about 30 years, that that's a short-sighted focus. And let me give you an analogy that I think that comes to me a lot, and that is our state prison system. Our state prison system is dysfunctional, and it has submerged into a sea of litigation. And what you have now is the largest prison system in the world being managed by a few federal judges and special masters as a result of litigation and not much progressive management of our prison system, which, depending on your philosophy, may be a good or bad thing. But I think in terms of public policy, that's not the way to formulate a system. I think if we preserve the status quo in terms of governance and the Delta and the ecosystem, we're going to see happening in the Delta what has happened to the state prison system, that we're going to go to a litigation footing and we're going to see control over resource management, water allocation, ecosystem restoration move from the executive branch of state and federal government to the judiciary. And you're going to have judges, and like Judge Ollie Wanger in Fresno is doing now with respect to San Joaquin River flows involving the Delta smelt and salmon species, being asked to do jobs for which they would be the first to tell you they are ill-equipped to manage a comprehensive, very complicated and sensitive ecosystem. My view is that litigation as a policy tool for management of the Delta is an ill-considered one and ultimately a defeating one. The only ones who will prosper under that regime are the lawyers who are hired by the various sides to go to court. So whenever I can, and I realize this is not the American Bar Association or the Association of California Water Agencies where I've made the same pitch, that we ought to leave our litigation guns at the door and pursue more constructive, dare I say, holistic systems of reform. Well, where is all this going? And I think 2009, for a variety of reasons, is shaping up as the critical year for the future of the California Delta. There were various efforts, including by our governor and some legislators, to jumpstart our process and some other related processes that I haven't had time to talk about by adopting legislation in 2007, having a special a session of the legislature, or now adopting a water bond this year, and for a variety of reasons, largely resulting in relating to the general political gridlock in Sacramento these days. That hasn't happened, which has still kind of preserved the options, I guess, for us and the Delta Task Forces as policy advisors to shape our recommendations and present them to the governor and the legislature. But 2009, I think, will be the time when those recommendations will be out there and they will be either embraced or ignored or amended. The one thing that's pretty clear is that between the looming drought that we're facing, the continued crashing of the Delta estuary system, the ecosystem, that we don't have time. We don't have a lot of time to fuss around. There's always more research to be done, and the scientists have more research to do and more advice to give, but we don't have the luxury of waiting any longer. And I think most people realize that, not to be overly dramatic about it, but I think 2009 is a make or break year for the Delta. So we'll see. I'm looking to Sacramento, and what's happening now with the budget gridlock doesn't give me a great deal of confidence that there are enough grown-ups in the room under the dome in Sacramento. I hope that's not the case, but I tremble for the Republic a little bit from time to time. Hopefully I'll be more optimistic the next time I visit with you. Okay, I mentioned the Delta Vision has a good website. All of the documents that I've talked about, including every comment letter that's sent in to us and response that we provide, background information reports from the Scientific Advisory Board, are all available on the website. And for those of you who are interested, I encourage you to pay attention to the website and to our future deliberations. And I'd love to take some questions and answer any concerns that you have. Thank you very much. I think if I hold on to that, if I do this, we're going to get that feedback. Why don't you? Okay, great.
If I can ask to use this for the.
Rick, thanks for a very good overview, but I am puzzled by one thing. You downplayed litigation at the end, and yet in your talk you emphasized the importance of the reasonable use doctrine and the public trust doctrine. Public trust, certainly as it applies to water rights, is exclusively a creature of litigation. So I'm having trouble in my mind reconciling those 2 points you're making.
Well, I think that's right. The public trust doctrine, to a large degree, has been developed through case law. The cases I mentioned leading up to the Mona Lake decision of the California Supreme Court, which, by the way, celebrates its 25th anniversary this year, that anniversary hasn't got the attention it deserves, and the so-called Racanelli decision, which specifically applied public trust principles in the context of the Delta in 1986. I guess my view, Hap, and the questioner is my law professor, Hap Dunning from UC Davis. I think you and others have done a good job of setting the table and creating in California law through the court system a very robust set of public trust principles. But as the courts are now beginning to say in those more recent public trust cases that come along, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to be up to the executive branch of government, State Water Resources Control Board, Department of Fish and Game, other regulators to carry out those public trust principles and further them or contravene them. But again, it's part of that. There's only so much that courts can do. I think particularly in the Mona Lake decision, the court articulated in a very thoughtful way how the public trust doctrine relates directly to water rights principles and water rights systems in California. But I think it's going to be required of, in this case, the State Water Resources Control Board, which in California is a hugely important agency, both with respect to water quality issues, water pollution issues, and water supply and allocation issues, to really take charge here. I'm somewhat heartened by the fact that 3 days, I think 5 days after we issued our vision statement, the State Water Board adopted its own new proceeding to address those Delta issues and concerns that are within its jurisdiction. That's a long-term process, and we'll have to see how that goes. But again, I think there's a role for litigation, but I'm saying those who would rely on litigation to the exclusion of these somewhat less sexy, less more ongoing processes, such as we have at the Water Board and in terms of wildlife management at the State Department of Fish and Game and other resources. I think that's where, in the long term, a lot of these environmental challenges are going to be successfully addressed or not. Two in the back and one over here.
Going to ask the next question.
I can shout if you want me to. I'm both fascinated and a little troubled by this concept of the super agency that you talked about. Just a couple of questions that might illustrate some of the troubling concerns. Where would you draw the boundaries of this agency or super agency, and what would it be its position in California government and relationship with various branches of that government and of the federal government?
Well, good question. The short answer is I'm not sure yet, and that's a work in progress. One of the things, though, in terms of the federal government, again, we just are reporting to state government officials, but one of the things your question evokes, and I want to spend a moment talking about, is how, to the maximum extent possible, assuming you buy into the concept of a overarching, powerful state entity, and I understand the questioner may not, how do you encourage the federal government and federal policy to correspond with that state proposal as much as is reasonably possible? In our deliberations, I think we've come to the conclusion that under existing law and political systems, the best vehicle to do that is through the Coastal Zone Management Act, a federal statute that requires, once certification of a state program is obtained, requires federally proposed and implemented projects to go through the state, come before the state entity to review whether those federal proposals and projects are consistent with the adopted state plan. So part of our recommendation, part of our governance reform is that the CZMA process, as is known, which already exists with respects to California's 1,100-mile coastline and San Francisco Bay, be extended inland to encompass the delta, which we believe current federal law allows to encompass the delta. So that's the way we hope, the best and most effective way to ensure a fair degree of federal consistency with state program. I've also got to say that it's part of it is going to be the power of persuasion and collaboration, and I don't want to be partisan about this, but I think again the senior President Bush and President Clinton's administration were far more collaborative with respect to various initiatives to preserve and protect the delta that is interacting between state and federal officials than has been the current administration in terms of funding levels, in terms of moral support, and in terms of day-to-day coordination. I would hope that whatever the results in the November election, we see reforms on that end.
I just have a quick question. I've heard Westlands is buying up land around Davis, maybe, or the Delta. Do you know what they're doing?
Not really. No. Worth watching. I don't. I can't answer that question. I'm sorry.
Hi, I have two related questions. First, you expressed a disagreement with Peter Glick that water conservation would be adequate to sort of meet some of these, current demands for water in California. And I wonder if you could elaborate on your views for the need for more water conveyance and storage. And related to that, if groundwater storage is a part of that solution, what sort of legal changes to groundwater law might be needed in the state of California to facilitate such a strategy?
Well, in terms of conservation, let me be clear. Water conservation, I believe, as I think most people who focus on it, water conservation strategies are the most best short-term, most economically viable solutions to the water shortages that we face. So I think that, and I think our report has made that point. That's where you start, and you work really hard, and collectively and individually we can do a lot better than we have. In terms of storage facilities, you didn't ask this question specifically, but it seems to me in terms of surface storage and ground storage, underground storage, I much prefer the latter option for any number of reasons. I think it's environmentally more sustainable and it makes a lot of sense. Assuming we do that, and there's a lot of groundwater storage efforts that are being done on a decentralized basis in the Central Valley already. We're talking about stepping up that effort considerably. How that ties into groundwater rights is a very good question, and implicit in your question, and I put it out there, unlike surface waters in the state, which are subject to a great deal of regulation and requirement, at least post-1913, to get permits from the State Water Resources Control Board for most surface water rights. Not true with respect to groundwater. There is California is the only state in the American West that does not regulate groundwater extraction and groundwater supplies. So it's largely, on a statewide basis, it's kind of the Wild West out there. And as a result, you see a lot of overdrafting, what have you. That said, and this goes back to my north versus south, there's some local counties that have adopted groundwater management ordinances. There are probably, I think, 27 counties in the states that do that. But 2 points there. Southern California water districts and local areas have, in the aggregate, have done a better job of groundwater management, effective groundwater management of individual basins in Southern California than the Northern California counterparts. And the other thing is many of those groundwater management ordinances that you see around the state are intended not to preclude exportation of those groundwater resources outside of the county or outside of the region, but don't address the issues of day-to-day management and which farmer or which ag interest is dipping his pump and straw too deeply into the common groundwater resource. So there are all kinds of problems there, and I see that, again, speaking only for myself, as one of the great anomalies of California resource planning that given the the situation we've got with respect to population and water supply, that we remain this outlier and refuse to look at statewide regulation of groundwater. But that's another fairly heretical view in some circles. Who's got the mic? Yeah, okay.
You spent much time talking about Delta Vision and what they recommended. I'm not an academic. I know that the Delta's in big trouble. I know that the state legislature is dysfunctional. I know that the economy is in trouble. I would appreciate, 2 or 3 sort of down to earth things that we could work on. One of them you mentioned, which I didn't realize before, that something controlling how wells are done around the state would be indicated. Are there a few other down-to-earth things you can suggest that we might work on in the next year to try to deal with some of these issues?
Yeah, and this actually ties into some of the near-term actions that we recommended the governor and the legislature in our vision statement that I didn't have time to cover. One is emergency preparedness. I mean, learning the lessons of Katrina. We've got about thousands of people who reside in the Delta, and many of them are, really in danger of a calamitous situation. The last major levee break we had in the Delta was on a calm, sunny summer day in Jones Tract. It was not a product of flood flows. So this can happen at any time. And again, we've got more and more people living and working in an environment where, based on a levee system and flood protection that was designed to protect, alfalfa growth and low-grade agriculture. So. And again, Ray Seed, my colleague on the task force, I think has been very thoughtful here. And he was in New Orleans days after Hurricane Katrina, looking at the causes of that and the levee failures, doing some emergency preparedness and advising those folks who are there now. And it's much more difficult, much more of an intractable problem. What do you do to protect the people who are already there, based on land use, entitlements, and construction that's already there, than it is to avoid compounding the problems of the past. That's the second part of it, though. As our near-term actions, so that's one, emergency preparedness. Another is we saw in our testimony that as in the Lathrop area, you've got some developers trying to propose major development in floodplain areas that really need to be preserved for long-term flood control management to in anticipation of those increased winter runoff patterns that I was talking about. We really need to preserve and expand those floodplains. The Yolo bypass is as an engineering feat, a very effective base to provide flood control in a fairly environmentally benign way in the Sacramento Valley. There's no similar approach or device or flood control system, floodplain management system for the San Joaquin River. That's very much necessary. I think that's something that can be done right away. But getting out and getting either through buying those floodplain areas, condemning them, buying them, or getting easements, having government go in and preserve the ability to effectively use and maintain those floodplain areas, as opposed to building subdivisions in the middle of them, which not only makes those floodplain areas unavailable to protect adjoining areas, but puts those people right in the crosshairs, is something we shouldn't be doing. So that's another area that we said in terms of near-term actions that the governor should be working on right away. And the last one is that we urged the governor to do what he could through executive order to halt this urban encroachment into the Delta while we work out the long-term land use reforms. So that's a handful of things that we talked about.
Thank you. Interested in your comments on levees. If I own a piece of property and I want to keep my kids or my cows on it, I build a fence and me and my neighbor split it, or I pay for it. If I need a public transit district, maybe something as big as BART, of course my neighbor and I can't do that. We set up a special district. It's a logical funding source. What is it about levies that gives them any claim on a broader public's pocketbook than those neighboring people? Are there navigability issues? Would the environment be harmed a whit if some of these islands sank?
I think the short answer is it depends on the levees. And one of the virtues, I think, of the Public Policy Institute report that came out in February of 2007, it made the point that all of the islands in the Delta, all regions of the Delta, are not equal in terms of their economic value, their ecological importance, or their value to the sustainability of the Delta as a water conveyance system. And the cost of armoring all the Delta levees, that is to bring them up to 200-year flood protection status, would be prohibitive. That's not going to happen. There's just not enough money to do that. So the more difficult problem and challenge is to go through the Delta and figure out, realizing that we're looking at sea level rise, we're looking at increased winter flows and increased flooding in the winter. We have a seismically active area, and we're looking at major earthquakes. You know, the hard question, which of these islands do we want to save, preserve in the long term, and which are we willing to let revert to a more natural setting? And as part of that, going directly to your question, is the issue of financing. There are some islands which our deliberations showed have great value. If you believe in the continuation of a through delta means of conveying water, you absolutely have to preserve some of those islands to preserve the freshwater quality and to protect against saltwater intrusion that will damage and make the through delta diversions from the state and federal water projects available. So again, a lot of people don't buy into that, but particularly those who are opposing the idea of an alternate conveyance peripheral canal, they're saying, in effect, let's go with the status quo situation. So if you find yourself on that side of that particular political debate, there are some existing levees that are going to need to be shorn up, have to need to be improved. It's at substantial cost, and I would argue that as to those, there is a broader public interest in the reconstruction and improvement of those levees, so at least part of that cost probably ought to be borne by the taxpayers. There are some in-delta interests who would take the position that all of the cost ought to be borne by the general public, and the reality is probably somewhere between the two.
I was just wondering if you could comment on the idea of sizing the isolated facility or the peripheral canal and its role in determining total exports from northern to southern California.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's talk a little bit more about the peripheral canal because, in my opinion, a lot of it comes down to governance issues and trust issues. Most of the scientists with whom I talked and from whom we've received testimony and some of the environmental groups, sometimes privately, not all of them will want to go public with this, will say, in the abstract, it probably makes for a healthier ecosystem to have an alternate conveyance facility and not be using the delta as a plumbing system, as a water conveyance system. I think we would all agree if you were starting from scratch, you wouldn't pick this kind of Rube Goldberg approach of bringing water through the delta and shipping it out through the south end. It's not the ideal, most efficient, or environmentally benign way to go. But that said, what are you going to do? But getting to your point directly, I think it's really a question of trust. So if you buy into the idea that it would be better in theory, in the abstract, to have a peripheral canal, an alternate conveyance, the question is where, how wide, operated under what conditions. And that's not been satisfactorily addressed by most folks. And presumably this planning process, the CEQA process that the California Department of Water Resources is undertaking will begin to answer those. But I think, again, for the reasons I mentioned in terms of reversing this nonsensical situation of exporting more water from the Delta in drought periods and dry periods than in wet periods, it would make sense, in theory, to build a large conveyance so that you can take advantage of and capture those flood flows and those wet year flows and ship them down to reinvigorate, replenish groundwater banks and whatever. But there's a lot of distrust. A lot of distrust. Well, if you've got the plumbing system, what's to prevent, if not this governor or this department from doing it 10 or 15 years from, turning the faucet on full speed and, operating it 365 days a year at full capacity. So, and that's a legitimate concern. So it gets down to trust, it gets down to governance, and I think there's dysfunctional governance system right now, and there's not a whole lot of political trust. So those are going to be big challenges.
One final question.
Are you concerned with the possibility of another proposition vote being placed in front of an uninformed electorate, similar to the one in '82? Maybe one that's still stuck in a north-south mindset. And has the PPIC report and the work that you've done in the task force provided enough political coverage, in your opinion, for lawmakers to create policy that would be painful in the short term but needed in the long term?
Yeah. The first part of your question is easier to answer than the last. I think there's a good chance that whatever recommendations are done, that we may see it on the ballot, either in terms of an initiative measure where the voters take their own policy choices to the voters, or a referendum where the elected officials make a policy decision, and then the voters, unhappy with that, seek to have the voters nullified through the referendum process. That I believe, keep me honest on this, I believe it was the latter scenario that played out in 1982. I think there was a proposal to adopt a peripheral canal, and the Proposition 8 in 1982, the Peripheral Canal Initiative, was a referendum to void or supersede the proposed decision of, I guess it was, must have been the Reagan administration, Governor Reagan's administration, to go forward with the peripheral canal. It was successful. But yeah, in this fractious environment, I think it's quite likely that whatever decision is made by the gubernatorial administration and the legislature, it could result in a legislative challenge. And again, it comes down, not to be too cynical about it, but one political expert I know said you can get anything. You could get a McDonald's restaurant menu on the ballot if you have enough money behind the initiative or recall campaign. I think there's a fair amount of truth to that, as witnessed by the correctional officer's decision yesterday to launch a recall initiative against the very governor who was the beneficiary of the last recall campaign. So it's entirely possible. Whether the second part of your question, whether the political leaders have the political courage to go forward and adopt some of these hard recommendations in terms of governance structure, in terms of any number of these potential fixes, I don't know. I certainly hope so, and to the extent the Delta Vision process and the task force provides them some political cover to do that, I think that's terrific, and we're happy to serve in that role. But I spent the better part of the last 2 years working on this process. I'd like to see something good come of it, and everyone in this room will have to make their own decisions as to what the future of the Delta ought to look like. But again, I would encourage you to weigh in on that and devote a fair amount of your time in 2009 to those efforts. I think they'd be well deserved. Thank you.